Almost a full calendar year since we first experienced Trump's U.S. tariffs, and the U.S. Supreme Court could rule as early as today on their legality. So the justices will decide whether U.S. President Trump had the authority to impose sweeping import duties without congressional approval. The decision could have major implications for U.S. policy, global markets, and the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. So lots at stake today. For more, I'm joined by CTV News political analyst Eric Ham. Good morning, Eric.
Good morning. It's good to be with you.
Eric, remind us, what was the burden of proof here, and where do things stand with this case as of today?
Well, this is a case that is going to decide whether or not Donald Trump can use the powers of the International Economic Powers Act to actually implement these tariffs. And what is at stake is, as you mentioned, not just the balance of power, but we're talking about tens of billions of dollars, because if in fact the Supreme Court rules against the president, they will likely have to return nearly $200 billion in the tariffs that they've already collected between 2025 and 2026. And that certainly will open up a can of worms, because the U.S. government is not in the habit of actually returning money, and Donald Trump specifically certainly will not want to do so. What are the U.S. president's options once a decision is made? Well, we're told that by the administration that they do have a number of ways to actually get around or skirt this if, in fact, the Supreme Court rules against them. One area where they believe they can move is actually on implementing licensing fees to actually continue to collect these revenues. Now, that probably will likely end right back up in court. But what we're told is, even though the president is concerned that the court will rule against him, they are still moving full speed ahead with trying to collect fees from countries around the globe as a result of this trade imbalance that we're seeing play out. And I would imagine they would continue in that direction, regardless of the ruling, if they are going to plan to do an appeal of sorts. Listen, we've noticed with the second round of Trump administration, he's used the interpretation of another law to justify a move that seems to violate other laws. So in this case, you mentioned it, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which allowed him to skip congressional approval for tariffs. How might this decision, either way, affect U.S. trade policy with our country moving forward? That's a really good question. I think what we could see, if in fact the president is struck down in court, I think that actually gives him more incentive, not less, to actually walk away from CUSMA. Now, right now, CUSMA is actually a massive protection against many of the tariffs that the president is implementing. Of course, major tariffs on steel and aluminum still remain in effect. But nevertheless, we're talking about 80% of goods that are protected. But as we look ahead to negotiations on CUSMA, Donald Trump is still looking for an enormous amount of leverage. And if he loses in court, I think what we could see is the president looking more, not less, likely to walk away from CUSMA as a result, as in a way to try to extract more concessions from Canada. That's a really good point. Eric, beyond the money, what does this case say about the balance of power right now between the U.S. president and Congress? Pivotal because of the actions that we've seen in this new year with Venezuela. That's certainly true. In fact, already now we're beginning to see members of Congress begin to push back on the president. We've seen that just yesterday when 5 senators joined with Democrats on the War Powers Act, limiting the president's military authority in Venezuela. But in addition, should the Supreme Court strike down the president's tariffs, what that does is that gives a big boost to Congress, because what that means is the issue of tariffs will stay squarely in the hands of Congress. So another blow to the president, but also giving more of that power and less of an imbalance that we're seeing already play out between the Congress and the executive branch right now in Washington. Eric, remind us, because these rulings and the issuings of the ruling are different from country to country, and we're dealing with the U.S. Supreme Court. Is there an appeal process for the president here? No, if the president loses, then what we will see is the president, as he has said, he will move into other areas to try to keep the spigot open for these revenues to come in. But it could certainly open the door to more lawsuits and recriminations that would put the Trump administration right back in court. All right. What are you watching for today, Eric? I'm watching to see exactly how this will come down, because I don't think the Supreme Court is going to actually rule where it just gives a blanket ruling against the administration. I think there's going to be a balance that we will see from the Supreme Court if, in fact, if in fact the ruling comes down today. But more importantly, what are some of the specific moves that the administration will take to actually try to keep these revenues coming in from many of these countries?
CTV News political analyst Eric Ham, great to have you back on the show. Thanks, Eric.
You bet. Thank you.